and I think we're going to have an interesting and intriguing talk by Ben Rowswell. He's going to be talking about an application that he and his co-founder have come up with. It's been alive and well for about a year, going into its second year, and it's called Betterplace. And that I'm intrigued to know what it's going to be doing. But let me tell you a bit about Ben. Ben has most recently been the ambassador to Venezuela. And he has been with the embassies and the diplomatic corps in Egypt, where I believe he probably met his co-founder in the current venture. He's also been in Iraq and Afghanistan, and while he was in Afghanistan, he was the representative in Kandahar. So he has had quite a lot of international experience. He is now with the Canadian International Council, and this organization, I think, is probably out of the Mars Discovery District and various other places in Canada. I wasn't quite sure where the head office was, because I wasn't sure that I know. But anyway, this project that Ben is going to talk about is a project that is endeavoring to help the general citizen, you and me, to become more active and responsible in civic endeavors. And I will leave it to Ben to explain exactly how this works. So without further ado, here is Ben Rowswell.
Hello, everyone. So, fake news, Russian hacking, an increasing polarization between an increasingly radicalized right and a radical left. These are frightening times for democracy in many of our countries around the world. By now, I think it's commonplace to accept that technology has something to do with it, and that can be kind of scary and disempowering in itself, because I don't think anyone believes that we're going to be putting the genie of technology back in its bottle. No one's going to uninvent the internet or forget social media altogether. And so that has led us to a collective moment of anguish about the impact that technology is having on our society and the quality of the democracy that we value so much. My goal today is to offer a perspective on how we can understand the impact that technology and software in particular is having on our democracy, so that we can do something about it. Let me start with, by way of context, an observation about the profound impact that software is having on our public life and who we are as a society. These are pictures of the Me Too movement, celebrated in Time's Person of the Year edition just a few months ago. The Me Too movement, I would argue, is an unquestionably positive impact or a social change to which many people ascribe an important role of software. Why is that? Because it's not just the Me Too movement, it's actually the hashtag Me Too movement, and the hashtag refers to a feature in the software called Twitter that has allowed these voices of women to be expanded on a massive scale. So I think in all of our lives, we started hearing quite a few stories coming out in September or October of last year of women that had suffered sexual harassment, sexual abuse, or worse, at the hands of men in positions of power, predatory behavior by men in positions of power. This, of course, is a practice that has existed probably for as long as human beings have existed. And up until 2017, it was quite common for this to be relegated to sort of a secondary concern in society, or for people to say it will always be thus. There was something that changed in 2017, something to do with the volume of stories that came out, something that has to do with the sheer number of women that shared these stories that changed. There was like a critical mass of testimony being given to predatory sexual behavior and how expansive it is in our society. Well, that critical mass was reached in part because the women sharing their testimonies used social media and used features like hashtags. A hashtag is a function of Twitter whereby if you insert the word hashtag #MeToo in your tweet, it immediately goes to everyone else who uses Twitter who also is following that hashtag. And that means that a woman sharing her story is not just sharing with the few hundred or maybe a few thousand people that might be following her on Twitter, but could be read instantaneously by tens or hundreds of millions of people. So when you get a large number of women using this hashtag, they're reaching the entire world and inundating them with these stories of harassment. So technology and software have played a role in the success of the Me Too movement. Let me now turn to an unquestionably evil influence that software is having on our lives. This is a picture of Islamic State, the so-called Islamic State, a terrorist group that rose seemingly out of nowhere in 2012, 2013, managed to conquer large swaths of Iraq and Syria in 2014, but also has proven able to recruit people in our own societies and to commit horrible acts of violence in the United States, in Canada, in the United Kingdom, and elsewhere in Europe. A lot of the discussion about ISIS focuses on the distortion of Islam, their use of religious justification for their acts of unspeakable violence. But one other aspect that's, I think, quite important in the story about ISIS is, again, their use of software. If we suspend the discussion about the religious, the distortion of Islam for a moment, I think we could probably all accept that in every society there's a tiny, tiny fraction of people, maybe 1 in 10,000, maybe even 1 in 100,000, that actually enjoy causing harm to other people, sociopaths, people that draw some kind of pleasure out of maiming or perhaps murdering other human beings. In regular society, in normal society, those people are relegated to the margins, they're suppressed, they're kept under control, the damage that they can do is mitigated. But software allows those 1 in 100,000 people to connect with one another across the entire world, to share with one another, to form bonds with one another, and to form a community of people that have a shared interest in the maiming and murdering of other people. And it's partially through that affordance of software that Islamic State has been able to reach out to that tiny, tiny number in our countries and to mobilize them to commit terrible acts of violence against their fellow citizens, against our fellow citizens. This particular case was a reference to the bombing of a rock concert in Manchester being attended by young girls and their parents that killed more than 20 innocent civilians. So software started shaping the reality that we live in, sometimes for good and sometimes for evil. And sometimes it depends on your perspective. But I do think it's also unquestionable that Donald Trump is now President of the United States in part because of software and in part because of his mastery of Twitter in particular. In the second tweet here in particular, he cites what he likes so much about social media. It's that he's allowed to communicate, or he's able to communicate directly with everyone on his Twitter following, which last time I checked was 34 million people. He's able to communicate with those people without going through any filter or any intermediary. There's no third party to say if what he is tweeting about is true or false, if it's responsible or irresponsible, if it's a productive thing for society or a negative thing. He communicates directly with them. And because he's quite good at Twitter and he's quite good at framing a conversation and generating a reaction and tapping into the emotions of his Twitter followers, that is a tremendous source of power for him, one that he was able to leverage to become the most powerful person in the world. So software has already started to have this tremendous impact on the societies in which we live. I have been doing some research over the past few months with the Canadian International Council, with Caroline Allante, my research assistant, who's here from the CIC. My great thanks to the CIC and to Caroline for her help. We have been looking into how software shapes democracy. I will be making 3 arguments. The first is that the influence of software on our democracy is so vital and so present that it's important for us, it's imperative for us to study it. But secondly, that it's not software in general or technology or the internet in general that is impacting, that each and every software platform or software program has a different impact on our society and therefore needs to be studied separately, that we could do so through the concept of affordances, which I will introduce shortly. The third contention I will make is that by understanding the impact of different software platforms on our democracy, that we can then start to take back control and to start exercising influence over software and to exercising influence over the kind of democracy that we want to build. So this is the one slide in which I will discuss theory. I'd like to introduce the concept of affordances. Affordances can be understood as the actions that a given technology facilitates or makes possible. Software is a tool. Like any other tool, humans build these tools in order to allow people to do something, to accomplish some kind of objective. What objective a tool is built to accomplish is its affordance. So every tool has a feature. We build a tool to have certain features. We can think of a very basic example. A teacup is a tool. A teacup has two features. One feature is that it has a bowl shape, which allows it to hold liquid. The second is that it has a handle, which means that you can hold and bring it to your mouth, even if it has a hot liquid inside. Those are two features of a teacup. The affordance of the teacup is that it allows the drinking of hot liquid, and that's why teacups are built, why they're created. More sophisticated technologies, when they become very widespread in their use, start to have a social outcome. So let's use a tool that's a little bit more sophisticated than a teacup, a telephone. So in the 1870s, I believe it was, when the telephone was invented, it was invented for a certain affordance of communications, but not just any kind of communications. What are the features of the telephone? Any telephone system, at least before wireless telephones were introduced, featured wires with devices on either end that permitted one-to-one communication. So one device would take the voice message, would transmit it electronically through the wire, and the device at the other end would convert that into an audio signal, and vice versa in real time. So that is what the engineers actually set out to build when they build a telephone system. One-to-one voice transmission by wire. The affordance of a telephone is communication between two people, no matter what the distance. So for the very first time in the 1870s, it was possible for people here in Toronto, for example, to have live conversations with, say, family members in London or business associates in New York City or what have you. And that had a social outcome. The social outcome can be captured by the commonly used phrase, "It's a small world." My guess is we didn't say that very much before the 1870s. That it's partially because of the ubiquity of telephones in our life that we do feel that it's a small world, because those cousins that we have in London or those business associates down in New York City could be part of our daily lives through real-time conversation. So that's an example of how we can understand the technology through its affordance. Let me now turn to three commonly used software platforms or software programs that I believe are all having a profound impact on our democracy. The first is Facebook. So how many people in this audience have a Facebook account? I would say about 2/3 or 3/4. It's a very, very widely used tool. What are the affordances of this software? Let's start with the feature. There are many, many features of Facebook, but one of the most important is the personalization of mass communications. So I think it's probably obvious to people that don't use Facebook as well. If those of us that do all took out our devices right now and opened up Facebook, we would all be looking at different content. We would all have our own feed from our own friends, of issues that we care about, and it would look different. There's 1.7 billion people that use Facebook, and all 1.7 billion of them have something different appearing on their screens at any one given time. That is the personalization of mass communications. What affordance does that create? Well, if you're sharing things that you care about with people that you care about, there's a sense of validation that what you are reading and what you're saying is important, and who you are is important, and that kind of validation creates a sense of community. Those of us that use Facebook quite extensively do so in part because we feel a sense of community with the people that are on Facebook with us, that we want to share with them, and that we want to have that sense of belonging to something larger than ourselves. That's why it's such an appealing product. That's why so many people use Facebook, is because of the sense of community. For example, I have been out of high school for 30 years now, but I, like probably many of you in the audience, are still in touch with people from high school. I went to high school in Ottawa, so not only has it been a long time, but I also am not physically close to a lot of the people I went to high school with. And without Facebook, I probably would have drifted off and not really had any contact with them whatsoever. But Facebook makes it ridiculously easy to keep in touch with people across great distances and across great time. And that's a very appealing feature, or social outcome of Facebook. But what is it doing to our society as we create this sense of community in these groups of people by the hundreds in Facebook? I'd like to leave you with the image of a high school cafeteria or a middle school cafeteria. Facebook feels like being, when you're using Facebook, it feels like you're being at one of these tables. Chances are the children at this closest table that you can see feel some sense of community with one another. They probably choose that same table every time they go have lunch together because they know that their friends will be there and they'll be talking about things that they like and that they're interested in, and they have some sense of shared values. Chances are they don't freely mix and go to other tables. That if this young girl who's talking to the people at the first table were to move on to the other, there would probably be some kind of awkwardness, some kind of discomfort. And that's because the communities that we create, not only do they bring us together, but we tend to separate the communities from one another. That as we are sharing on Facebook and feeling that sense of community, we are also cutting ourselves off from other people. That Facebook creates many, many, many different communities that are not necessarily communicating with one another. The concept is called homophily. It's a natural human tendency. It happens in all societies. It happens on Facebook as well. Facebook is essentially creating small groups of people that share quite intensely with each other and reinforce their view of the world, while making it more and more difficult to communicate with people in other communities. And that's because not only is it easy to connect with people on Facebook, it's very easy to disconnect. Just think of the last time that someone on your Facebook feed posted something supportive of a politician that you loathe. It's very easy to unfriend that person. They'll never know about it, and you're never going to see anything in your Facebook feed from them ever again. And so Facebook actually helps us sever certain links while we're connecting people. And that has an impact on the quality of our democracy, because if we are becoming more and more closed off in these small groups, we're not having the exposure to people of different perspectives and the interaction of people that have different interests and whose conflicting or competing interests need to be reconciled for us to all live together as a society. Let me turn now to Twitter. How many Twitter users in the audience? So fewer, but still maybe about a quarter. I should put my own hand up. I'm quite an active Twitter user as well. What are the features of Twitter? As we all know, it has the feature of extremely short messages, initially 140 characters, now 280, but it's still a very, very short message, a tweet. It's also very easy to make connections, even easier than Facebook, in fact, because in Facebook, the other person, when you send them a friend request, they have to accept. In Twitter, that's not the case. You want to follow someone, you follow them, and they have no say whatsoever in the matter. And as well, there are no filters. These three features combine to make it insanely good tool for sharing information. Because if people can write and read messages in 1 or 2 seconds, and the network, the connections on Twitter are formed very, very quickly, you get a situation where messages can spread throughout the entire network extremely rapidly, facilitated by hashtags, which I was referring to earlier. So you don't even need to be connected to people in order for your messages to go to them and for them messages to go to you. Twitter produces an affordance of an instantaneous spread of information. That makes it quite compelling to use, because if you're following some kind of political event or you hear about some kind of natural disaster, the chances are, if you're a regular user of Twitter, you're going to find out about it first on Twitter. Why wait for a newspaper to write a news article about something 5, 6, 7 hours later, when you can find out about it the minute that the reporter finds out about it and the reporter tweets about it? There's an immediacy to Twitter, which is quite exciting. And sometimes that means that you find out some pretty important things through Twitter. For example, when the US military launched a raid on Osama bin Laden's hiding place in Abbottabad, Pakistan, the world found out about it not when the US military decided it was time to share the news, but when a neighbor of Osama bin Laden reported that there was a US military helicopter hovering above his compound. This was the tweet that broke the news of the raid, and this is the social outcome of Twitter. There's a kind of radical openness that what's happening in the world is accessible to all of us by just getting onto Twitter and finding out about it right now. But Twitter is also shaping and changing the society that we live in. It changes it in a different way from Facebook. So you remember, Facebook creates these small groups characterized by homophily, with the image of the high school cafeteria. This is a bit the kind of society that Twitter creates. It creates a very dense public square. Imagine being in a crowd like this, and every single person in that crowd having a conversation or saying something, and not even having a conversation with each other, but just sort of shouting out to the world. That's what Twitter feels like. It's a very noisy, loud, chaotic place. That can be good for transparency. There are certain advantages to having that kind of crowded public square, but there's also some disadvantages. If any of you has ever been in a crowd like this, you know it's also a place where some pretty unpleasant things can happen. You can get pickpocketed, you can get groped, what have you. When humans are in a deeply public space, sometimes our antisocial behaviors come to the fore. And it's the same thing on Twitter. Twitter is a radically open place where information spreads very quickly, but it's also a place where some pretty negative human characteristics manifest themselves. So for the third software, I'd like to talk about Wikipedia. How many people have at least read something on Wikipedia before? So basically everyone. How many people have actually written or edited content on Wikipedia? I see about five hands. So you know that Wikipedia is written by the crowd, as it were. Yet every one of us has the right to go to Wikipedia and to start writing whatever we want. There is an editing process, but it's essentially open for everyone to create knowledge. The feature is called the co-creation of content. So co-creation is when many people gather together jointly to create something, whether it's a work of art or a piece of knowledge. The power of co-creation is that because you're opening the doors for everyone to create, the sheer volume of what you can create is unparalleled, unprecedented. And so there's a mass proliferation of content on Wikipedia. To give you an idea of the scale, let's compare Wikipedia with a more traditional encyclopedia, the Encyclopedia Britannica. This is actually not to scale because the blue triangle would be almost invisible to you if it was a side-by-side comparison. So just to give you an idea, there are something like 5.5 million articles on Wikipedia. There are 120,000 available on Encyclopedia Britannica. And that's partially just because of who's involved in the creative process. So there are 4,000 contributors, 4,000 people writing content for Encyclopedia Britannica. There are 2,360,000 people contributing, writing articles for Wikipedia. And then editors, there's even more. There's 32 million people that have edited content on Wikipedia. That's why there's 63 times as much information available on Wikipedia than there is on Encyclopedia Britannica. So the social outcome is this mass availability or ubiquity of knowledge. So the image I'd like to offer there for the kind of impact that Wikipedia is having on society is, imagine being in the world's largest library and having that always with you at anywhere you go, as long as you have your connection to the internet. So let's talk about democracy then. What kind of impact do these three different softwares have on democracy, and how does our understanding of the affordances of these various softwares impact on democracy? So let's take democracy. This is a standard definition from the Merriam-Webster dictionary. If we understand democracy to be a system of government in which the supreme power is vested in the people and exercised by them, either directly or indirectly, the affordances of Facebook, Twitter, and Wikipedia will have an impact on our democracy to the extent that it affects the citizens' power or their ability to exercise that power. Let's go back to Facebook and to Homophily. When we are all organized into those little high school cafeterias of information or of community, it's much easier for fake news to be propagated. Fake news thrives in an environment where people assume that they're going to share the same type of information and agree with the same kind of information where it won't be challenged. That happens in spades in Facebook. It's not only a problem of Facebook, but Facebook has been a platform where fake news has propagated and had a tremendous impact on democracy. These are all examples of fake news propagated primarily for people who lean right in the United States, and that were deployed in the 2016 electoral campaign in order to encourage people not to vote for Hillary Clinton and to vote for Donald Trump. But we could replace all of this content with fake news on the other side of the political spectrum. Fake news is an outcome of a world in which homophily has run wild. Let's look at the political impact that Twitter is having with this kind of radical openness. As I mentioned, there's many advantages to that crowded public square. Information can travel very quickly. There's a kind of equality of access to information, and yet there are some pretty antisocial things that happen on Twitter, and anyone who's a woman and who's expressed a political opinion has probably experienced that. There is a culture of harassment of women that is quite widespread on Twitter. I've seen this with the groups of activists that I've worked with, human rights and democracy activists in other countries of the world. When there are prominent women in those circles, they tend to be singled out for attack as women. I apologize for the language in some of these tweets. These were actually some of the more gentle words that were used to try and demean and harass women on Twitter. It has happened in our politics as well. The Minister of the Environment, Catherine McKenna, is a frequent target of abuse on Twitter. She's referred to as Climate Barbie by her critics on Twitter. Many women abandon Twitter as a platform because they just don't want to deal with these kinds of tweets. To her credit, Minister McKenna gives as good as she gets, and she has stayed on Twitter even though it's become an extremely unpleasant environment for her, with Climate Barbie being a way of demeaning her as a woman, as a powerful woman, down to the attributes of a plastic doll. So for Wikipedia, with this ubiquitous knowledge that it's been able to generate, that also has a political impact. I suppose there are certain positive impacts to having citizens that are better informed. It's certainly easier if you're reading a Globe and Mail article about, say, the carbon tax. You don't quite understand the sort of intricacies of what that means. You just go to the Wikipedia entry and you've got, presto, you've got an instant orientation around that topic. But it's not all positive. One negative aspect of us all having this knowledge at our fingertips is that we're just a little bit less trusting of institutions. Previously, in the era before the internet, before Wikipedia and other sources of information, before Google as well, we tended to rely more on what journalists told us the truth was, or what politicians told us the truth was, because they had access to more information than we do. Now that we all have access to information, we're just that little bit more skeptical of what journalists tell us and what politicians tell us. We're that much more skeptical of institutions. That may be a positive thing, but the strength and power of a democracy is also correlated to the strength of the institutions and the ability of citizens to trust institutions. And so if we lose our trust, our democracy may also be weakening as a result. Now, each one of these software companies that I mentioned are under the gun right now and feeling the pressure as their role in shaping democracy, the unintended consequences of mass adoption of those platforms is starting to have political consequences and harming democracy. This is a picture of one of the chief executives of Facebook getting a grilling before the US Congress after the 2016 election, when it became clear that the Russian government had been able to have virtually unfettered access to the Facebook platform, with the company doing very little about it. They have recently tried to redesign Facebook to change the way that the algorithms operate so that there's a little bit less of that high school cafeteria dynamic happening, but they have a long way to go. Twitter, likewise, is conscious that there's a problem with the harassment of women and the harassment of vulnerable groups in society in general on its platform, and so it pays a lot of attention to trying to clean up the tone of content on Twitter and to make sure that vulnerable populations feel more safe. Wikipedia has developed really quite an extensive way of vetting information while leaving it open to everyone in the world to write something on Wikipedia to make sure that that content is being reviewed by other people. And when there are differences of opinion over what is written on Wikipedia, there are extremely extensive and totally transparent debates between Wikipedians about what should appear and what should not appear. So each one of these organizations is slowly trying to react to the unintended consequences that their software has had on the quality of our democracy. I believe that there's more to be done. I think that governments certainly have more of a role to play in making sure that the technologies that are increasingly widespread in our society have, on the whole, a positive impact for the ability of citizens to influence decisions that affect their lives, the very essence of democracy. I believe that all of us as users of software have a responsibility to use that software responsibly and to be informed in how we're using it and what the impact of sharing our own personal data is. I believe that there's a major role for civic education, and so I salute all of you that are participating in continuing education. I believe that all citizens have a lot to learn about how software is impacting on us, and you are taking this first step by participating in continuing education in this way. But there's a lot more for our educational institutions to do. But could we actually go one step further? So instead of having these software programs run rampant through our societies and then trying to play catch up to mitigate the negative impact, could we go farther and actually build software for a positive political impact, a positive impact on the quality of democracy that we have? If we go back to the definition of democracy being about citizens having the ultimate power in society and exercising that power, are there ways that software could increase the power that citizens have in society? Could we get to a situation where software is not leading to the manipulation of citizens, such as with Russian hacking or fake news or what have you, or abusing citizens, as we've seen with the treatment of women on Twitter, but where software actually empowers citizens? This is what we're trying to do with betterplace. How are we doing it? Well, to go back to this concept of affordances, if we build tools in order to have a certain outcome, what we're trying to do with betterplace is to start with the affordances that we want to exist. What kind of impact do we actually want there to be? And then we work backwards from that to build the software, to create the features that will lead to that affordance. Our work is predicated on the assumption that for citizens to exercise more power, they should be more involved. The more engaged a citizenry can be, the more influence that regular citizens are going to have on outcomes in society. And so the principle of affordance that we wanted to facilitate with our software is to make civic engagement widespread, and we do that by making it easy to do. So we spend a lot of time trying to think about what would make it easier for more people to get involved in civic action, whether it's a cause in their community or at the national level or even at the global level. If there's something that you care about and you have thought about doing something but haven't quite got around to crossing that line between being a concerned observer or an interested bystander, crossing that line to action, to actually doing something. We have landed on a software app as the way to do that. As we're all getting addicted to these things, we might as well make the best of it. So instead of using your addiction to share more cat videos or what have you, let's see if we can use our addiction for something good. So we essentially have loaded onto our software platform, our mobile app, a whole range of opportunities for people to do good in their communities on whatever issue they might be concerned about. It's a highly interactive interface where you're not just passively consuming information, but you're sharing information about what you're interested in, what your interests are, what your skills are, and then tapping and swiping and doing all those kinds of things that make software apps so incredibly addictive. We're trying to leverage your addiction for social good. The second thing that we're trying to do, the affordance that we're trying to create, is that civic engagement become relevant to you. And how do we do that? Well, we're trying to take a page out of Facebook with that feature of personalization. Facebook personalizes the news that's presented to you through your reading of that, the content on that app. We're trying to personalize opportunities for civic action so that when you go on your smartphone and you indicate that you're interested in a certain issue and that you have certain skills that you can bring, it will generate, or the algorithms of betterplace will generate a task that's relevant to you, that you are more likely to take than something that your neighbor might find. Machine learning allows us to do that. We can essentially design algorithms that will allocate a different opportunity to civic action to everyone sitting in this audience. And in that way, raise the possibility that each and every one of you might take action and might become that more engaged citizen. Here are some examples of some of the tasks that you can do in betterplace that are currently available. The one on the far left is run by an organization that is trying to educate people about the lingering effect of structural racism in our society, so that even if individually fewer and fewer people espouse openly racist views, there's still certain disadvantages to members of visible minorities in our society. This task is primarily oriented towards people like me, who are in the majority, that might not be naturally aware of some of the disadvantages that our society places to people from minority communities. So the task is relatively simple. It's to read a little bit about structural racism and then to have conversations with 5 people in your life, any 5 people, and then come back to the app and confirm that you've done it. The idea is to spark as many conversations about racism as possible so that we spread awareness about it and we start to catalyze people from being sort of passive and maybe unwitting participants in racism to being people that actively try to stop the patterns that continue to keep visible minorities and others in disadvantaged positions in society. In the United States, where our software has been deployed recently, there's a lot of concern about the abuse of power by authorities against migrants, sometimes legal immigrants, as well as undocumented Americans, or sometimes called illegal immigrants. The Immigration Control Enforcement Agency, known as ICE, has been known to be called in when a Latino perhaps speeds on the highway or has a parking ticket, and then that Latino finds themselves sent to Mexico, sometimes into very violent situations. And so concerned citizens of an organization called the Washington Immigrant Solidarity Network, WISN, runs a hotline. So if people in the United States view an enforcement action by ICE, they can call in and make sure that the person who's on the receiving end of that enforcement action knows what kind of rights and what kind of resources they have at their behest. They're also recruiting people to actually be participants in that hotline as well. And then in the third one, don't be a bystander. This is a task that's been proposed by a group that works on homophobia, to counter homophobia and transphobia. It provides a script that everyone could use in case they witness a homophobic attack or harassment of people on the basis of their sexual orientation. Say you're riding on the TTC and you see a trans person getting verbally abused. Rather than just sitting there, which is probably what a lot of us would do because we're awkward and we're embarrassed, we don't really know what to do, or we're afraid of the person who's committing the abuse. This gives you some tips on how you can stand beside the person who's receiving the abuse and show them some company and some support, even if you don't say a thing, to educate you about what kind of things might be going through that person's mind, what their needs might be, and to essentially be a human being to someone who's suffering that kind of abuse. So you see, these are all tasks that don't take a massive commitment. You don't have to promise that you're going to volunteer every Friday for a year. You don't have to, for example, open your home to a refugee family. These are all wonderful acts of civic engagement, but they're probably beyond what most of us have the time or ability to do. But there are things that you can do in the space of just a few minutes or an hour that if we have enough people doing them, we'll start to shift social attitudes. We'll start to move the needle on certain recurring problems in our society. The key is to try and figure out which of those issues matters to each of you and which you would be most motivated to actually do, and that's what our software attempts to do, to allocate tasks like these to each and every one of you individually. The last affordance, if democracy is about citizens having power, we want to make sure that citizens are in charge of the experience as much as possible. That goes for everything for the protection of data, personal data. If you're on Facebook, you have virtually no ownership or control of the personal data that you're sharing with Facebook. We've built that from the opposite perspective, that the users of betterplace will have total power over or control over the use of personal data. But we also want to eventually have a totally open and decentralized system where people that are taking action are not just responding to the opportunities presented by NGOs or organizations, but that you yourselves could present opportunities for other people to get involved. So that as people get more and more active, they earn more and more points through a system of gamification, and once they get to this threshold that we've notionally established of 500, they would then unlock the ability to propose actions that others can take so that they can become, they can mobilize their own friends and family. And in that way, always make sure that the person that has the most power and authority over betterplace are the users of betterplace itself. In closing, I hope that I've shown that there's a way of looking at the impact of different software platforms on our society and on the democracy that we cherish, that knowledge gives us the ability to do something about it. I believe that ultimately the best way to ensure that software is shaping our democracy in the right direction is to make sure that those of us that care about democracy are shaping software and the software that we use every single day. Thank you very much.